the challenges of migrating to QR codes. I'm here with Bob Carpenter, Chief Executive Officer of GS1 US. Welcome, Bob.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Now, your organization is a non-profit that is helping industries like the supply chain one move into the 21st century, I think. Can you tell us a little bit about your mission and what you do?
Sure, we're a neutral, not-for-profit standards body. We operate in about 117 countries around the world. So think boots on the ground in those countries, speaking the local language, working with regulators, serving from those 117 countries, about 150 countries around the world. And our role is to administer a set of standards for uniquely identifying products, locations, and companies. And our mission really is the identification of everything makes anything possible.
Wow, the identification of anything makes anything possible.
Everything
makes anything possible. That's wonderful. I know that this industry has been absolutely plagued by a lack of standards from the beginning. I mean, the fact that we only just had containerization come in, well, I guess it's 70 years ago now, 75 years ago.
Right.
But that seems amazing to me that things weren't standardized before. And there are still a lot of issues to do with standardization. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
There are. I mean, the first scan at point of sale in a retail grocery store was in 1974, and it was really designed to expedite point of sale checkout. And the brand owners put a barcode, what's called a UPC-A, one-dimensional barcode on the product. Right. That holds a number called a global trade item number, and that allowed that checkout process to be automated. And I'm old enough to remember when that wasn't the case, going with my mother.
Sure.
And so that began a whole series of productivity enhancements around order to cash, warehouse automation, that has really helped revolutionize the supply chain space over the last 50 years.
Right, fantastic. And barcodes are palindromic, right? They read the same backwards as...
They do, yes they do. I was thinking good word choice.
Right.
I'm brushing up on my SAT testing. But yes, you're absolutely right, Helen.
Yeah, so QR codes are two-dimensional.
Correct.
Are they also, do they read backwards and forwards and upside down and
they do.
Every which way?
They do. But I think the real advantage of a 2D code, and when we talk about two-dimensional codes, there's also a code called a data matrix. Mm-hmm. And in some respects, we put radio frequency identification tags in that 2D category. And the reason is whether it's an RFID tag, data matrix, which is very prevalent in the healthcare space, or QR codes, they can carry an orders of magnitude more content in the code. But in addition to that, we have a standard called Digital Link, which allows you to use the same supply chain application identifiers. So think 01 for that number in the barcode, the global trade item number, or 10 for batch and lot information, or 17 for expiration date. Now I can put that in a web address, a URI, that is encoded in a QR code, which allows a lot of people to access that QR code in different ways. So today, most of the QR codes are a dedicated URL that goes to a website that a brand owner or someone else controls, and you can access a lot of information. But if I try to pull a piece of information out of that code, I can't do that. In the context of the standards that we're developing and bringing to fruition in 2027, you could embed things like expiration date or sustainability data or that serialized GTIN number that uniquely identifies the product. And that can all be parsed out of that code so that different people along the supply chain can use the information in different ways. Think somebody in a warehouse for batch and lot information, or maybe a store associate in a retail environment who needs to clean up a spill of a product and needs safety sheet information.
Right.
All that could be encoded in the code.
Right, and you talked about URI as opposed to URL. What is the
Universal Reference Identifier. So the identifier is just really a generic term for any identifier that would be used as a standard. URL actually links to a dedicated site.
To a dedicated site.
And you're testing my tech knowledge, so I hope I got that right.
Thank you. So, you're seeing an increasing adoption of QR codes, and I think you said that there's been some unequal geographical experience with QR codes that's now evening up a bit. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. No, it's fascinating because I think prior to the pandemic, there was, I think, some disdain for the QR code in the United States. even though it was incredibly ubiquitous in Asia and even parts of Europe. But then the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden we needed to go back to dining outside with a menu that no one wanted to touch. And amazingly, a QR code was a great tool to do that.
Right.
To just link to a digital web or a menu. So,
and I think a lot of people here at the conference are using QR codes instead of business cards now, I've noticed.
Correct.
What do you think that disdain for QR codes was about in America?
You know what, it's a good question, Helen. I don't know. I think sometimes the quality of the data that people would access through those QR codes was underwhelming. And so I think consumers got very negative because the experience oftentimes wasn't very good.
Right.
And but that really applies to a lot of things that we use, because if the consumer engagement, if the UX, user experience, isn't great on a website, guess what? You're not going to go back.
Sure.
I think it's same for any kind of digital interaction. So
right. It's interesting that it caught on so well in Asia, though. It's funny. So what are some of the advantages that QR codes and other kinds of two-dimensional indicators and standardization offer to the supply chain industry?
Well, I'll talk about healthcare for a moment, if you don't mind. In the pharmaceutical space, there was some regulation passed almost a decade ago called the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And it required that you'd have a serialized global trade item number, which is a unique set of numbers that would distinguish one pharmaceutical product from another. Even though that was both the same product, it would have a different serial number.
Right, like a batch, if there was a different batch or whatever.
Exactly. Well, but also you had to include a batch number, and you had to include an expiration date.
Right.
Now that is encoded in a data matrix, which is a 2D code with the GS1 standard, so that that product can be followed all the way through the supply chain to make sure that it's not counterfeit, that chain of custody is maintained all the way through, so you have pedigree.
Right.
And that's a wonderful, and I think one of the more forward-looking examples of 2D codes that are really serving the patient's interest around drug safety and making sure that we get the right product to the right patient.
That's really interesting. So you've got provenance and pedigree, and these are things that a lot of supply chain buzz is going on about blockchain at the moment.
Yes.
This sounds like a cheaper, easier, more easier to understand version of that. Would that be fair, that you can have the kind of security that people are looking for from blockchain much more easily with this?
Well, I mean, it's a bit of chalk and cheese, as the Brit would say, because I would say how we capture the information versus how we share the information are two different things. You could choose a permissioned or unpermissioned open decentralized ledger, a blockchain.
Right.
You could also just use a shared database and agree as an industry these things are universal. There's no competitive advantage in the type of product or the batch or lot information, and I'm happy to share that. But for things that are permissioned, blockchain can be a very clever way to do it. But I think people are sometimes applying a hammer to a problem that doesn't necessarily require that degree of force.
That's
if you understand my analogy.
Yes, I certainly do.
So sometimes the good old-fashioned shared database is absolutely fine, Helen.
Thank you, Bob, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
We've been talking about the challenges of implementing QR codes and other forms of standardization in the supply chain with Bob Carpenter, Chief Executive Officer of GS1 US. Thank you so much for joining us.